Well, today we have Felipe Duval on the show, our new show for the church, the Faith Informing Podcast. And we are going to be talking to him about his new book, just called Gender as Love. I have a copy of it here. It's a theological account of human identity, embodied desire, and our social worlds. And Felipe is a professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the Bible and Theology department. He's also the chair of the department. And I know Felipe from my days at Trinity. Him and I were both students there at the time. I can't remember how many classes we took together, but the one that's memorable is um, I think it was called Global Theology, and we went to Mundelein Seminary for it.
Yeah, yeah. And then we visited a African church and then had a Chinese buffet afterward. Do you remember that?
I don't I don't really remember
What?
that.
My memories are all orientated around food, so
It's funny. One of the things I really remember from the Mundelein trip, were you part of the group that went to the karaoke night with all the priests?
yeah, yeah. And the nuns singing Beyonce. Yeah, it's
Yeah. Yeah, it was like Kanye West, Beyonce, and
yeah,
80 priests in training. And then
yeah,
us Protestants, we were there, and I was like, this is a totally new world for me. This is
yeah.
hilarious.
I we could use more karaoke in more places, in my opinion, you know? It brings people
Well,
together.
maybe in your role as a seminary professor now, you can start a karaoke movement
Yeah,
at TEDS.
I could. That will be the answer to all of our problems.
We all need a little bit more play in our lives, that's for sure.
It's true. Yeah.
So as we get started in our conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in theology, and then we'll talk about what got you interested in the topic of gender.
Yeah. Theology. I became a Christian in high school, so relatively late in comparison to the friends I had. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, which is not a lot of Christians around, and didn't really know anything about it. I had some cultural Christianity downstream or upstream of my upbringing, but it wasn't a big part of my life. And then I became a Christian in high school. I was in a rock band, and the drummer of the rock band invited me to which is, I tell my students that, and they're like, that can't be true. But it's absolutely true. Even if today my being in a rock band seems highly unlikely. But
I feel
yeah,
like being in a rock band in Seattle, were you guys trying to be the next Nirvana? Was that the goal?
if I say yes to that, it would be the most misleading answer ever, because we had a very short-lived career, I'll tell you that.
That is great.
But I mean, yeah, so became a Christian in high school. I was always sort of inclined toward reading, writing, life of the mind kind of stuff. Growing up, my mom would make me read an hour a day before I could watch TV, you
Mm,
know. So I was
sounds
always
like a
sort of,
good mom.
yeah. I'd like to put that practice in my own family, but I sort of thought, okay, what do people like me who have these sorts of interests, what do they do? Well, I thought at first I was going to be a pastor. And then I found out that pastors have to do a whole lot more than just like read books and give sermons. As I'm sure you know. Sometimes they have to do interviews like these. Uh, but so I did an internship, and I thought, oh man, maybe I don't really have quite all the gifts necessary for being a pastor. So I went to Calvin College, Calvin University now, and I thought, I'm gonna go to a Christian school. I just become a Christian. I'm gonna go to a Christian school, um, and I wanted to study something that would that basically I was looking at all the sort of people who I admired, and it turned out that a lot of them got philosophy degrees. So I was like, all right, I'll get a philosophy degree. I went to the right place. Calvin's got an amazing program, and really enjoyed myself. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll be a philosopher. That sounds really cool. I can ask these big questions. I can sort of, that like fits well with how I think God has equipped me. And then I came to the realization, but the last semester of my uh, degree, that I really only liked philosophy because it allowed me to talk about God. And then I thought, oh no, that's not good at all. There's a whole lot more to philosophy than that. So I I was like, okay, what do philosophers who talk about God, what's a job that sounds like that? And at the time I was reading a book by Kevin Van Hooser. And I was like, well, he kind of sounds like somebody who talks about God in an interesting sort of way. What's his job? And he was a systematic theologian. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll go to TEDS and study with Kevin Van Hooser. And I did. And it was, yeah, it's funny that I'm back here now, but it was this desire to sort of put my, the way that God has sort of organized my upbringing and the people in my life to cultivate these gifts in me and put them to good use. And that kind of meant, I kept going down the academic route, and at every step I said, hey, maybe I'll get rejected by every PhD program I apply to. And then at that point I'll go find something different to do. And so then I got into a PhD program, and I was like, okay, great. So when I start applying for jobs, if I don't get any jobs, I'll drop it all and go do something new. And I got a job, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm supposed to be doing this. So so it was a lot of like, doors opening tentatively, and me just trying to see where I should be. And I'm still figuring that out. I mean, it's just like it's a daily active discernment to figure out what
Mm.
God wants from me and figure out what I should be doing. And that relates to how I got into gender too. There have been several times when I thought I should just give up on it because it's such a hard topic. And when you're talking about gender, you are not just doing something purely theoretical, you are often coming up face to face with the deepest wounds of God's people. And I was like, man, and everybody's usually unhappy with how you're talking about it. Like a theologian who talks about gender is not usually, some people love the theologian part, but not the gender part. And some people love the gender part, but not the theologian part. And here I am trying to be both. So yeah, but it was a consistent sort of perceived need of the church. In my mind, a theologian is somebody who acts in service of the church, through academic pursuits and so on, and the writing of books and teaching classes. But ultimately, there's this accountability to the needs of the people of God, and I'm trying to be responsive to those needs. And so, yeah, I've been thinking about this for the last 10 years or so, probably over 10 years now, but
It's
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the connection, especially to Calvin.
Yeah.
A number of our members at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church are
Mhm.
graduates of Calvin University.
Oh, really?
Um,
Okay.
yeah, many of them actually. And so lots of deep
Yes.
ties. So what were some of the professors that had an impact that on you while you were at Calvin?
Yeah, I mean, the turn to gender for me was in a particular class that I took with Ruth Grunhout in the philosophy department. And it was a philosophy of gender class. And I had no idea what it was about, but I needed a class trying to graduate early. This very spiritual motivations. Trying to graduate early, and she was teaching that class, and it knocked out three of my degree requirements. And I thought, yeah, for three requirements all in one class, I'll take anything. And so I took that class. I didn't expect to be really gripped by it. She was an excellent professor, introduced me to all kinds of conversation partners and new questions that I had never been heard that were being asked before. And I remember asking her and saying like, "Hey, what are the theologians saying about this stuff?" And she was like, "Sadly, not much. Either they ignore these questions altogether, or if they do think about them, they just paint a little Christian veneer over them, over whatever theories on offer." And so, yeah, having that conversation was really formative. So Ruth Gernhout and I mean, Alvin Plantinga was around. It was nearly impossible to get a class with him, but I saw him rock climbing multiple times, which was pretty impressive for a man in his like late 70s. He was like doing all this rock climbing. Uh,
Like on the Calvin rock climbing wall?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Just like you're just walking by, and there's Al Plantinga on the wall, you know. And then I remember one time I was walking by and somebody nudged me. They were like, you know that he just had heart surgery 2 days ago, and I was like, that's not okay, right? He shouldn't be up there.
Someone should stop him.
Yeah. So,
He was
yeah.
so Alvin Plantinga also was a member here.
Oh,
Um,
really?
because he was teaching at Stanford, or I don't know if he was a member, but he at least came here
Uh,
for a while because he had some fellowship or something at Stanford for a while
oh,
and
okay.
had a season here at the church back in the day. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
what about Jamie Smith in the philosophy department? Because I noticed in your book it talks a lot about Augustine and his
yeah.
kind of view on love, and I know Jamie has also done a lot of work on that.
He has. Yeah. I love his work. In fact, I'm teaching a class where I'm using this book on the road at St.
Oh, there
Augustine.
you go.
So I quite like his work. Funny enough, I did not take any classes. He was on sabbatical for
Mhm.
much of the time that I was there, and when he came back, he wasn't teaching any classes. I already taken the classes he was teaching. They were more introductory. And so, I mean, I saw him around and I went to lectures he gave, but I never got to. So the Augustine and influence wasn't from Smith. It was actually in my PhD. I took an Augustine class,
Oh,
and I had read Augustine all throughout my education, but for some reason, reading the Confessions in my PhD for the like 19th time, there was something that clicked in my head about, the nature of human identity and desire and how we ought to understand the sort of crazy road that we call life and how the shaping of our identities often is attributable to more than just cognitive factors. That so often it's a matter of what we love, and that what we love is such a powerful influence in making us who we are. And I found that really gripping. And so it is, I think it was like March. So it was almost 5 or 6 years ago. I was reading Augustine's Confessions again, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's like, what have I been missing? I should have been focusing on this a long time ago. And and that, I mean, reading that alongside a lot of really recent Augustinian scholarship too, that are recovering Augustine's thought for all sorts of questions. I mean, Jamie Smith is a great example of that, but even in the academy, there's people asking questions now about like Augustine and race, like Augustinian theology and race, Augustinian theology and the economy and markets and notions of freedom that are imported into the free market and that maybe aren't so compatible with, so like how does an Augustinian notion of freedom match up with the kinds of freedoms that are associated with a free market? Like there's all kinds of really interesting stuff being done there. And I thought, oh, I can like sort of step into that conversation or that series of conversations that are being had and say something interesting about gender. So yeah. So there maybe it took some broadening and familiarization with of some other conversations, but it was reading the Confessions by myself in my PhD
that's
in tech.
amazing. I love that. The Confessions are just such I always say it's just like it's just one of the most powerful Christian books
Yeah,
to read. And it's so I find it to be such an enjoyable read.
totally.
Especially when you have a translation that's done well and
Yeah,
doesn't have to be in the super old English. Like there's
yeah,
good modern translations of it. And
totally.
interestingly enough, earlier this year, just a month or two ago, I finished up a class in our Sunday school with our members on the church fathers, and
Oh,
one of
no.
the final ones, well, I think it was the final one we did was Augustine. So we talked quite a bit about
Oh,
his
okay.
confessions. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's great, and so that's really good. So a question about gender. So I'll admit, when I first saw your book, I thought, oh, he's going to be dealing with transgenderism, which
Oh, yeah.
in some ways it touches on that.
Hmm.
But um, um, but then I got into the book and found that it wasn't that. It was actually kind of building a theological account of what gender is. And
Yep.
I found that really helpful and interesting. So I would love to hear you. If I were to come up to you as a Christian and say, Felipe, I don't understand why you're doing all this work on gender, because in the Bible it says God created us as male and female. So
Hmm.
what's the issue? Why are you
Good.
why are you following the ways of the world right now and dealing with all this gender stuff? What
Yeah.
would you respond to someone who might ask something like that?
I have a series of, yeah, lots of thoughts come to my head. A quick note on the question of trans identities. I did want to, and by the way, just the fact that like that's where your mind went first is like kind of an answer to your second question, right? Like, we are talking about gender when we talk when we are concerned about trans identities. Like it's, you know what I mean? Like that already is a point of complication and discussion that we need better answers for. So, but yeah, the reason I don't talk about it extensively, I'm contracted to write a second book, and I'm gonna have a chapter on that question in the next book. But I needed to lay down the groundwork because so often Christians are, and not just Christians, I think this is probably a societal sort of tendency. We want to talk about the hot button flammable issues
Mhm.
before we get our terms straight and before we get our definitions clearly in place. And like in my mind, it makes no sense to ask about the ethics of trans identities if we don't like, if you're asking, is it right for somebody to be transgender? Well, if you don't know what a gender is, then how can you like answer that question intelligibly, right? Or, is it what should a Christian stance be on same-sex marriage? Well, if you don't know what a sex is or a gender and how gender relates to sex, then that makes really no sense to ask that question yet, right? Because you need to have some conceptual tools in place before you do that. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book,
Hmm.
is to put those conceptual tools in place so that those downstream conversations that make the news about bathroom bill laws and whatever, hormone therapies and things like that, they make more sense because we have a clear-cut understanding of what the terms are that we're actually talking about to begin with. So why am I mean, that's partly my answer to that is, um, it's not as though we can cite Genesis 1 and 2 and say, job done. Now, I think there's like social reasons for that, and there's also really good theological reasons for that. I'll start the theological ones because I'm a theologian. The theological reasons for that are that there's a whole lot of Bible left, you know? And I think sometimes when we think about questions of gender, we so reductively go and we want simple answers, right? And there are like psychological reasons for this and so on, but if all I want to say is we'll go back to Genesis 1, theologically, that's not satisfying because Christians have more than just the doctrine of creation to work with. There's a whole lot of Bible left. And if we think about our social identities apart from the entirety of the canon of Scripture, if all we're working with is, you know, two chapters of the Bible, when there's an entire witness, like one of the things we talk about as systematic theologians is the importance of being of the biblical canon. That what God gives us is a canon, a great big story from beginning to end of how God is redeeming, sustaining, and perfecting the world. And our responsibility as theologians is not to just sliver away different parts of that story, but to see how all that we care about and all that we think about in our lives fits within that bigger story. And so, in one sense, just saying, well, here, just Genesis 1, boom, job done. It does, like theologically that's not satisfying, but culturally it isn't either because if we're all honest with ourselves, if we like step back from the sort of like intense debates that people have about gender, we see that we actually do care about this question. Like we care about the clothes that we wear. We care about, if I were to ask you, name the most manly meal you can think of, what would you say? You'd probably say like steak or something like that, right? That's part of our atmosphere and like the parts of the waters that we swim in. We had to think about, 100 years ago, we had to think about women's suffrage and the politics involved in that. Like, should women vote? And thankfully we said yes, but that wasn't that long ago, you know? And so gender questions are just out there. They're not something that we have to make up. They're not something that we have to um, they're not something that we have to sort of draw up from the ground up. And I could say more about that because it's one of my beefs with like a lot of Christian approaches to gender is that we tend to think of gender in terms of these like ethereal norms that just float in the air apart from the social goods that make up our worlds. But when we're talking about gender, we're talking about things that you just, you're scrolling through Instagram, you're going to hit against gender. You're walking down Target. I mean, I remember it was really stark for me when I was walking down Target and I was looking for a Halloween costume for my daughter, who's 4 years. You're gonna notice gender really quickly if you're looking for Halloween costumes. You see a gendered world very starkly, and that has more to do with cultural assumptions and expectations than it has to do with the kinds of the biology that we have. Now, that doesn't mean that biology is irrelevant, but it means that we have to sort of take this issue in the fullness of its complexity, that there is a gendered world out there. So let's describe it well before we start making
Mhm.
claims about it. So yeah, does that help? Is
Yeah,
that the answer? Yeah.
yes, that's
Okay.
wonderful. One of the things you talk about is how there's kind of two kind of classic ways to talk about gender. It's like either
Yes.
it's biological, like if you got male parts, you're male. If you got female parts, you're female. And or people talk about it, it's all socially constructed. Like
Right.
the reason my son loves cars and trucks is because he lives in a world that says boys should love that, and it's
Mhm.
all around him.
Right.
And my daughter loves to play with little stuffed animals and
Mhm.
dress up as a princess, things like that, because the world around her has kind of
Mhm.
told her that.
Right.
And I really appreciated you making those clear distinctions, but you offer another way forward.
Yeah.
You say there's a different way we can think about that.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, or not a little bit, but just go into that idea that you're kind of focused on, which really gets at the center, I think, of your work.
It does, yeah. The sort of debate that we inherit, and I think this is not just amongst academics, but it's just cultural as well, is this debate between, like you just rightly said, the biological essentialists and the social constructionists who have been doing this. They've been sort of seeing each other as mutually exclusive for at least 50 years, if not more.
Hmm.
Um, and so if you're one, you're not the other. And I I I witness this debate and I see the participants within it, and it struck me as an odd debate because at no point was I given a reason for thinking that we need to keep the debate on the terms that it has been offered to us. And in fact, the more I studied Christian theology, the more reason I had to think that maybe the framing of this debate was mistaken. Because as far like good Christian theological anthropology doesn't think that we're just bodies without social interaction or that we're just social without any givenness to our bodies. No, Christian theology affirms that we're both, emphatically both, right? And the incarnation offers no other alternative. That it's not like Jesus just the Son assumed a human body and then was like, all right, boom, job done. But like he lived a life, he ate food, he did all kinds of stuff, right? And so this tendency to say it's either society or it's biology, I thought to myself, there's gotta be a better way to think about this, right? Especially given the sorts of theological convictions I'm bringing to the table. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to say, well, the the two alternatives have something to suggest themselves. It just is the case, as I've been talking about, that culture plays an important role in how we think about gender. Just like I said, go to Target during Halloween. But at the same time, like we don't want to say that it's this sort of detached thing from the body. It's something that has an important connection to the body. But what is the nature of that connection? What is the nature of the connection between possessing a certain kind of sexed body, with the chromosomes that I have, the gonads that I have, et cetera, the amount of body hair and so on. What's the connection between those attributes and the sort of cultural attributes that make up our day-to-day lives. The fact that this is a men's blazer, men's sweater, and so on. That I go to the or I go to the store and I buy men's shampoo, or stuff like that. It's what's the connection between those two things? And so I'm trying to develop an account where we can take the best insights of the social constructionist account and its emphasis on cultural dimensions of gender, and we can take the best emphases on of the sort of embodiment or natural elements of being human without taking on the additional baggage of seeing them as mutually incompatible, because I don't think they are. And then B, like without taking on the stronger critiques that people have made against both of those views, which I make against both of those views in the book. Um, and so I try to say that the simplest way to see what I'm trying to develop, I draw upon two feminist theorists named Charlotte Witt and Mary Mikola, if you're interested in that. But I try to see gender as a kind of identity, which is kind of how people talk about it. Now, sometimes Christians have a little bit of an allergy to identity language, right? Maybe you've heard people say, I identify as a man, or identify as a woman, or I don't identify as a gender. And they said, that sounds pretty voluntaristic. That sounds pretty reductive. It makes gender a matter of our own will. And I get that. But I think that Christians have really good resources for helping us to understand identity biblically. Like I haven't heard many sermons on gender, but I've heard lots of sermons on Christian identity, and what our identity really is. And so what does it mean to say that gender is an identity? And what does it mean to say that it's one of the many identities that finds its home in our identity in Christ? And I tend to think about it kind of this way, like one of my identities is that I'm a professor. And if you were to ask me, what does it mean for you to be a professor? I would make recourse to all kinds of different social goods in my life. I would talk about the books that I read, the classes that I teach, the theses that I supervise, the salary that I draw, the institution that I work for, my computer that I do my work on. I would just start talking about all of these sorts of social and relational goods that make up my world and identity as a professor. Now, if I was at Starbucks working on my computer and I go to the bathroom and all you saw was this computer on its own, apart from context, you wouldn't know that it was a professor's computer, that it played a role in the organization of an identity for being a professor. All you would see is a computer. But insofar as I have all of these goods in my life that are organized into this identity as a professor, uh, then the computer takes on new meaning. And I think gender is kind of like that too. I think gender is about this is what I try to give a definition of gender in my book, because I thought maybe if I can do what the Supreme Court wasn't able to do, maybe I'll sell millions of copies and become super famous. That hasn't happened yet, so I can just give up my dreams of fame now, which is probably good for me. But I define gender as the organization of social goods pertaining to a sexed body in an effort to manifest something like an identity, which is a long sort of wordy thing, but that's the idea that I'm trying to capture, is that gender is less about abstract norms, but more about looking into the world that we live in and the goods that populate that world and organizing those aspects of our lives under different headings and different aspects of our identity. One of those aspects is our gender. And so there are things that we organize into our understandings of being men and women that go with that just reach out into the world and we appropriate to ourselves. And so that allows me to say some things about context and contextual specificity, because you can only organize the social goods that are in front of you. It's impossible for you to be a Chinese man in Palo Alto, California, right? It's important. In fact, it's probably impossible. There's probably important differences between being a man in Chicago and a man in Palo Alto, California. Maybe you can tell me because you've lived in both. Um, and I experienced this living in Texas and now living in Chicago. There are different kinds of social goods and expectations that are on offer. So that's what I think gender boils down to. But these things are organized around around the perceived sexed body.
Mhm.
Um, and so there is some kind, in the same way that, there are, I need to have sort of embodied elements to my being a professor, no matter how much online education I'm made to do, it's, I still need a body to do it, in the same way, there's an important connection to certain aspects of my embodiment that connect up with these social goods. And I think all that happens by means of our loves, which is something we can talk about too. But
Mhm.
that's me trying to thread that needle between those two views.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In the book, you do say you resist the um, maybe the inclination to name what are the male social goods, what are the
Yeah,
female social goods.
yeah,
You're resistant to that, which I really appreciated that because so often we get caught up into naming, well, what social goods are for men, what are for women,
yeah,
that
yeah.
it becomes unhelpful. And I think a lot of the challenges that come up in the church when it comes to gender is
Hmm.
that every context, like you said, every location, every church has its own
Hmm.
ideas about what a man should be like and what a woman should be like. And
That's right.
when an individual man or woman does acts in ways or participates in things or whatever it may be, does things, wears certain things that
Hmm.
don't align with that certain context for male and gender, there
Hmm.
can be tension. And I think
Yeah.
your book kind of encouraged me in the sense of like, um, just because someone is breaking certain social norms in their context does
Hmm.
not mean they're being less male or less female.
That's right.
Would
That's
you agree
right.
with that?
Yeah, yeah. This is exactly why I'm writing a second book now. It's because enough people were like, well, what are those social goods? And I'm like, I can't tell you that. I don't know where you live. I don't know. Yeah.
Hmm.
I've never been to Palo Alto, California. And so I couldn't possibly tell you. But I think that question is, it's not asked with enough specificity because we what we tend to mean is what should gender be? What should social goods be? What we don't mean is like a descriptive analysis of gender. Like really, if you want to know what gendered goods are, go ask a sociologist, go ask an anthropologist. There are plenty of books that tell you that. But really, what people want is not just descriptively what is the gendered world like. They want a normative account from theology to say like, well, it's not just the case that men do wear pants. It's actually that men should wear pants, or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
that's
I'm trying to push back and to say, well, no, like the normativity that we're looking for shouldn't come from gender itself. And the sort of obvious reason for this is that there's no Christian uniform. There's
mm,
no Christian diet, there's no Christian, I mean, at least I don't think there's a Christian political party. Right? These things are less about the rightness and wrongness of something is more about its use than it is about its intrinsic attributes, right? So, I have a cup of coffee here, and if I tell you I drink a cup of coffee a day and it gets me out of bed in the morning and it's nice, but I don't overdo it, you'd say that's good, right? But if I tell you I drink 16 cups of coffee a day and I'm like addicted to it, and if you cut me open, I'll bleed coffee. Um, you would say that's an unhealthy relationship to coffee, right? So, and this is this basic Christian insight that like anything can be turned into an idol,
mm,
anything can be misused and turned towards sinful implementations.
mhm.
And that's no different when it comes to the gendered goods that make up our world. Um, Somebody asked me one time, because I'm writing a chapter also on clothing and gender. And somebody asked me, is it wrong categorically for a person of one gender to wear the clothes of another gender? And I had to think about that. And I think it's pretty hard to say that that's wrong categorically. Now, there are some things about, but the example I give is this. It used to be the case. Now, there are fashion historians have written about this, but it used to be the case that pants were exclusively a male garment, right? And it took women sort of pushing against the the norms and wearing pants for themselves, uh, a garment typically associated with men, uh, to sort of shift gender expectations in our society. Now it's not, nobody bats an eye at women wearing pants. And I think most of us would say that that was a good thing. Like the fact that those women had the courage to take a garment that was exclusively for men and wear them as a sort of subversive, you know. So it's what's more interesting and I think more theologically significant is the use to which something is put rather than the sort of the thing itself. Um, and so it's not enough to say like, um, is trans biblical or not?
Mm.
I mean, there's no way to answer that question because every trans person's different. They're bringing different kinds of stories to the table, and a sort of a pastorally robust response asks a series of follow-up questions before giving a definitive answer on that.
Yeah.
Um, And so that's the idea there is that if I were to write a book that says here's what men should dress like, here's what women should dress like, here's what men should eat, and this is what women should eat, like it would be an easy book to write and it would be useless in like 3 years.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yes, that's so
you know what I
true.
mean? But that's not what I don't think that's what scripture calls us to do. It calls us to engage our social worlds as we encounter them and then make these normative evaluations of that world according to who Christ has called us to be. Right. And so it's not enough to say, it's what's the purpose for which we are using these things, and is that purpose in line with God's call upon our lives?
Mm.
And that to me is the much more important question when it comes to evaluating gendered goods. Um, yeah,
So when you think about, um, the way God uses goods, the
hmm
way God is at work in the world,
yeah,
how does that affect the way we think about gender? Because in your
yeah,
book, you talk a lot about thinking about gender in light of the economy of God or
yeah, yeah,
God's. And if
yeah,
if I have that correct, that's like God's actions in the world or
yeah.
God's.
The big story of what God is doing.
Yeah. So in the reformed world that we're a part of, creation, fall, redemption, consummation is
That's
just
right.
part and
That's
parcel to who we are. And
my
you're not.
Calvin education is showing.
Yes, yes. We're all very proud of you over here. And, but the latter part of your book is dealing with that. So I just wondered if you might, as we conclude our time,
Mhm.
and I know that's a big topic, but
Yeah,
if you could just talk a little bit about that creation, fall, redemption, and how that, because
yeah,
I think most people don't, at least for me, I hadn't thought about gender in light of that narrative, just
yeah,
because I hadn't
yeah.
thought about it. And your book helped me to begin to think about that. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I'd like to tell I teach ethics. That's sort of like my sort of primary responsibility. And I tell my students that thinking about Christian ethics, it's kind of like thinking about you remember those like highlights magazines from the dentist office where you have those activities where there's two pictures and you're supposed to spot the seven differences, right? And then there's like a picture of like a train or something, and then like you're supposed to, yeah. And then that's the act. I say Christian ethics is kind of like that, where we look at the world that we see before us on one side, and then we look at the world as it has been promised to us by God on the other side. And that and our job is to discern the differences between these two pictures. In what ways are God's intended purposes for the world different than what we encounter in our world today? And then once we identify that, what can we do about it? How can we act in ways that are consistent with the redemption that God is bringing to this world? And and that's one way to keep that entire story in line, right? The what we do have, and at the beginning of our conversation, talked about creation, and I kind of said like we have a bigger story, creation really matters, and I try to show how there's some deeply normative elements about the creation account that shape gender. but it's not the entire story. In fact, Christians say that creation was good, but it's not perfect. The perfection of all things required the incarnation and so on, and even it, right. So I draw in Saint Irenaeus for this stuff, but we have to also take into account the way that the world is fallen and wrecked by sin, and how things are not the way that they're supposed to be, how Christ is bringing that into redemption, and how one day we're going to get to that other picture, right? And so the spot the difference exercise we can do with gender too, because right now there are people for whom, and I would try to argue that all of us experience our genders as broken and wrecked by sin, that there isn't one of us for whom being a man or a woman is a point of difficulty, of challenge. I say in the book that sometimes the call to love your enemy is not a very hard thing to do, because your enemy is right in front of you. You just look in a mirror and you find your nearest enemy. Um, and so very often our genders are points of difficulty, something that we have to work at in our discipleship. Um, and just talking about creation doesn't really acknowledge that, right? We have to talk about sin too. And then we have to talk about hope. What is it that gives gendered difficulty rich content for hope and deliverance, and more than what we see now, more than the pain that we carry with us, more than the sort of trauma that individuals carry from experiences of abuse, what more than the like finance dominated world that we encounter, where ads are just trying to shove their messages down our throats so that we can be better men and women if we just buy their thing. Like, there's got to be something more. And having that bigger storyline in mind, where Christ is coming to redeem not just the world, but specifically our genders, right? Christ is coming to give us a restored relationship to the social goods of our world, and he's going to fix the social goods too. There will be a day when all of the sort of really bad social goods that we have to navigate, they won't be around anymore, because sin will be done away with. And so I think having that bigger story in view helps us with that, because it allows us to be painfully honest about just how hard things are now. And then it allows us to hope for something better, and to say that, like, what we know now is not the end of the story, that there's an end of the story coming. And that end of the story says something about our genders. I spend a lot of time in my writing about gender and resurrection, and trying to argue that we will be gendered when we are resurrected, precisely for this reason. That God is going to show us what it means to be men and women in Christ, without pain, without difficulty, without the burdens of sin, in a way that is genuinely liberating. And we
Mm.
can taste that now in the slightest little bits.
Yeah, I love that. That is such a great, hopeful reality of our faith. Like, I think about my own life, and you know, because of the way male gender is
Mhm.
espoused in our world,
Yeah.
and the images that are coming at me all the time,
Hmm.
um, and how men should look and how they should act and what they should do.
Hmm.
When I am getting ready for the day and I look in the mirror,
Yeah.
that inner critic that has all those voices is
Yeah.
speaking to me like
Hmm.
you, and it's saying in some way, you're not enough. Like,
Hmm.
you're not enough, Travis.
Right.
You haven't reached what you're supposed to be.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is the fuel of the serpent in the garden, right? It's like,
Yes.
this is not
Yes.
enough.
Yes.
You deserve more than what you have.
Yeah, and those things take gendered tones, right? Like,
Yeah.
question of, like, if only I lost enough weight, a little bit more weight, maybe I'll be a better man. Or if only I had a nicer outfit, I'll be a better man. If
Mhm.
only, right? It's that stuff's real, and that's exactly what I'm trying to point to. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, because that takes the conversation about gender that's happening in our culture at large, and I
Hmm.
think for Christians helps us to see that whether you know someone who is trans or
Yeah.
whether you are trans is
Yeah.
not the only thing to be talking about, although
That's right.
that's an important reality, but
That's
also every single person who has a gender, so that happens to be everybody,
yeah. Yeah.
they are this is for them, that like we have to
Yeah.
work on this and address this, not
Yeah.
because we want to be that self-critical voice, but we want to
Right.
know who we are in Christ. And
Yeah.
so I love that. That's a great way to just kind of conclude our conversation. Thank you, Felipe, for just coming on and talking to me for a little bit.
That was
I really appreciate it. Just great to catch up with you a little bit too before we started recording. And yeah, we're just we wish you all the best here from PACRC, and just really hope that as you keep teaching and working with students and writing, that people will receive your work well and be formed by it. Uh, it's so important. I think of so many of my professors just had such a big impact on me, and so I'm glad to see more good professors coming around. So thank you
No,
so much.
it was a pleasure. Thank you for taking interest in my work too. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, happy to see it. And I saw also that it was just a couple weeks ago, Christianity Today was talking about it too.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
There was a review there. Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't read the review, so I don't know what they thought of it, but
yeah,
I I was just happy to see it getting some
yeah, yeah.
publicity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'll have an article next month in the Christianity Today on some of the stuff we've been talking about too.
Oh, nice.
They're
Great.
doing like an Easter uh, edition, and so I read about gender and the resurrection, and we're talking about literally this stuff that we just talked about will be in there. So, a shameless plug, it's anyway, yeah, bit of
That's
a
awesome. I'll keep an eye out for that, and I'll share that with the congregation as well. So,
oh, good, thanks.
okay. Well, take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, you too, Travis. God
All right.
bless.